You guys all do startups? Yes? No? How many of you consider yourself entrepreneurs? Boy, you guys are a bunch of stupid assholes, man. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about my side of the world in venture capital and what kind of changes I see happening in the industry. Some of it might be relevant for you when you're trying to pitch people like me to understand how our world operates and how we think about evaluating companies and why we might make decisions or not make decisions to invest in your startup. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what a new version of a startup is, which I've affectionately called a Daft Punk startup. We'll talk about the Series A crunch, which I think is really mostly bullshit, and then a little bit about our strategy in investing in lots of little companies and kind of something I call the lean VC. It's sort of an iterative approach to venture capital. And lastly, I want to talk about platforms and community, particularly about distribution, which I think people tend to overlook a lot, and maybe something about local versus global startups. All right, so here's the very quick commercial. I started out as a geek. I was kind of a shitty entrepreneur, but I had a very small exit in the 90s. Ended up doing some marketing work at PayPal and eventually investing in some startups on my own money. After I started running out of money, I had to raise money from other people, and then I started working at Founders Fund, got the chance to run the Facebook Fund for a little bit, and then started 500 Startups. 500 Startups is a seed fund and accelerator. We've invested in over 500 companies all over the world, about 40 different countries. We've had a few exits, and it's still a work in progress, but we seem to be paying the bills. And as I mentioned, we've invested, at this point, almost 600 companies in over 40 countries around the world. We have people in about 5 different countries outside the US. We're not in Europe yet, but we might be sometime next year. Okay, so the major changes that I want to mention in venture capital, there's really 2 very significant things that have happened in the last 10 years. One is the cost of doing startups or building the initial prototype stages of a startup have come down dramatically. So if you think about 10 to 15 years ago, what people were spending money on, they would typically be spending hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on software licenses for large database platforms and other software. They'd be spending it on hardware like Sun servers, and they'd be spending it on a lot of bandwidth. Most of those things now are either free or cheap, and they're in the cloud and pay as you go. So the millions of dollars you used to spend on all those servers and software, now it's mostly just the cost of the people who are building the product, and also on acquiring customers. So that other part is really the massive change in the number of people who are online. So about 10 years ago, maybe there was a couple 100 million people online, possibly even less. Now we have at least 2 or 3 billion people online, and if we count certain types of mobile phones that aren't yet smart, maybe another 2 or 3 billion. Those people are all over the world. They're not just in developed countries. They're in many, many places. And so you can reach a lot more people faster and easier and sometimes more cheaply than ever before. So those 2 things that people used to spend a lot of money on, building product and getting customers, at least for venture capital, was pretty expensive, might have cost you several $million in a seed or Series A financing just to get off the ground. In addition, we've had these massive changes in venture capital that happened around 2000, 2001, during the first dot-com implosion, and then in 2008 with the financial services crisis. In general, those things have been positive for the industry. Why have they been positive? Well, we stopped doing stupid shit. In other words, before in the late 90s, we had a lot of companies that were not making money. In fact, many of them were not making any revenue whatsoever, and they were being sold on public markets as being successful billion-dollar companies. And we found out that was not true at all, and a lot of people lost their money. In 2008, there wasn't really a problem in the startup or venture capital world. It was in another industry in real estate and finance, but a lot of those upheavals caused change in venture capital that made it hard for startups to raise capital for about a year or so. I'm going to talk through a couple of these things, but the other thing I want to just emphasize is venture capital is starting to become a little bit more efficient. In fact, it's also an industry that's facing disruption and going under change. Companies like First Round Capital, which started doing the seed stage model in the early 2003-4 timeframe. Incubator and accelerator models like Y Combinator. And then even large traditional VCs. Andreessen Horowitz is probably the most well-known for starting to spend a lot of money, not on the investing side, but in building other resources. And then one of my favorites, a company we invested in called AngelList. So what's going on? These startups are now being built faster and cheaper than ever before, and I would argue they're being built smarter than ever before. And many large venture capital funds will tell you, well, it still costs a lot of money to build a startup when you really get down to the business of scaling a company. And sometimes that's true, but actually I think they're kind of full of shit because they're just telling you the story that they want you to hear, which is to take a lot of money from them. And actually, in addition to building startups cheaply, you can get customers efficiently and more cheaply than ever before. And sometimes you can even do that out of cash flow and not have to raise money. Sometimes you can do it out of debt instead of out of equity. But in any case, we are getting better at identifying how to build products, mainly because we can measure customer interaction to those products in close to real time. We can put products out on the web or on a mobile phone. We can gather data about how customers use those products. We can make changes to those products and see where they like one version or another better. And we are not guessing so much at how we build startups anymore. We're really able to see the actual customer feedback and reaction to our products and use that to make informed product and marketing decisions. Note that I say not just product decisions, but also marketing decisions. So the product that I build and the marketing that I use both have an impact on how the customer perceives the product and whether they use the product, whether they come back or not. So that ability to iterate over the customer feedback and build a feedback loop into your product and marketing decisions is what's really changed in how we build software over the last 5 to 10 years. And folks like Eric Ries and Steve Blank and many others have written some great books and material on that. So these changes that we see now in building at least software and mobile startups, they're less capital than ever really required, at least in the first year or two to get off the ground. We have more customers to go after, and in fact, we have lots of interesting distribution channels to go after. And this is probably the primary point that I want to make throughout this talk today. Most people, when they are doing startups, think that product and engineering and maybe even design are the critical factors in whether that startup is successful. And I would challenge that belief in saying that although you need competency and even excellence sometimes in those areas, what is really missing in most successful startups is scalable, cash flow profitable customer acquisition. Let me say that again. What is missing in most startups is scalable, cash flow profitable, costs you less to acquire the customer than you generate in revenue somehow, distribution. And these things that we are trying to get customers on have had massive changes in the last 5 to 10 years. Search platforms may be around for 10, 15 years. Social platforms around for maybe 5 to 10 years. Mobile platforms probably only around for 3 to 5 years. And now messaging platforms like WeChat and WhatsApp and Pinterest and Tumblr and Instagram, all these things now faster and faster, faster. Platforms with hundreds of millions, even billions of users are just a few years old. Just a few years old. What does that mean? It means we don't know fuck about how to grow customers on those platforms. You think that marketing is some afterthought. You think that engineering is the hard skill. Actually, that's not even true. We're building all this plumbing layer, all this infrastructure. Amazon, Google, Facebook, Square, PayPal, all these different services now make it easy for any dumb fuck to be an engineer. Now, I might be exaggerating that slightly, but your ability as an engineer these days, you are a midget on the shoulders of giants. Those giants are named Mark Zuckerberg. Those giants are named Larry and Sergey. They've built all that hard infrastructure underneath. What's the actual challenge? Well, designing and making an easy and usable interface for people to understand is hard. That's still pretty challenging. But understanding how to do customer acquisition now on search, on social, on mobile, on video, on local platforms, in multiple geographies, paid and organic, in figuring out how do you take that information and drive it back into your product and marketing decisions. These skill sets are not well understood. We have schools for engineers. We even have schools for designers. Do we have schools for marketing? Not generally speaking. And if you think MBAs are going to teach you that skill, you are confused. So we lack, don't clap yet. Don't clap yet. We lack this core skill, which is absolutely critical to our startup success. And you are not spending enough time on this shit. Okay, let's move on a little bit. So we are starting to have some sort of process to teach these things, whether you call them incubators, accelerators, whether maybe you work for Facebook or Groupon or Rocket. There's starting to be places where you can learn these skills. They are not generally in schools. They are working on your own startup and failing, or working in some other big startup that's already got it working and learning from them. Those are how you learn those things. Maybe now incubators and other like venture capital funds that are teaching this, these might provide an education platform. I would also mention AngelList, probably the most significant thing that has happened in venture capital in the last 3 years, aside from maybe Y Combinator and the lean startup movement. AngelList has made it much, much easier than ever before for investors and startups to find each other, particularly in places that are not Silicon Valley, and to have their information about their startups and about their investment criteria to be shared more frequently. This is not just a place that's doing matching, it's also a platform for gathering data, for doing customer validation, and now even for building syndicates that can invest together. If you look at how these ecosystems are now starting to come together, we have large VCs, we have medium-sized VCs, we have smaller seed funds, we have angels and incubators, and now we even have crowdfunding platforms, Kickstarter and others that allow us to find capital at almost every stage of the ecosystem that we require. Now that's not true in every geography, but more and more as these ecosystems start developing, we'll see angels, seed funds, incubators, larger VCs, crowdfunding platforms start to help fill in each of the pieces that are required for companies to get capital at exactly the stage and size that they need. And yet, one of the concerns is this Series A crunch thing. Well, we have too many companies getting funded. Because it's so cheap and easy to build startups, every person is now building a startup. Every grandma, every person who thinks that they can build the next Facebook or Instagram is out there. And is that a problem? Well, no, it's not a problem. Some of those people won't be able to raise venture capital. Some of them won't be able to raise any forms of capital. Some of them don't deserve capital. And even some of those who do and have a tough time, they'll probably be able to find a way to keep that company surviving. Maybe they have to actually generate profits. Maybe they have to actually charge for their product and get some revenue from customers. But overall, the only sad thing is that these venture capitalists who sit on Sand Hill Road or sit in London now have a lot more startups to choose from. And generally, they are of higher quality and better startups than they have ever been before. So if we look at what it takes to build these startups, before 2000 and after 2008, what did we have? Before 2000, we needed these big servers, these big software racks. We needed a long cycle time to develop. We needed probably a lot of money. There wasn't too many places we could get that money. This was challenging. You needed to know the right people. This was the big fat dinosaur startup. It took years, it took millions of dollars. Fast forward 10 to 15 years. Now what's going on? We can use all this underlying plumbing and infrastructure. We have things that are in the cloud that we can use like Amazon Web Services, payments. We have all sorts of storage opportunities. We can build most of this stuff much more quickly than ever before. It requires very small amounts of capital. We can raise that capital from multiple sources. We are better and faster and stronger. We are the Daft Punk startup. We are a lean little fucking cockroach and we're gonna survive. Even if we can't raise money from big VCs, even if we can't raise money from some business angel who thinks he's too cocky and too good, even if we have to charge our customers for our products, we might be able to survive. And this is a hopeful story. And even if we fail, how bad is it if we fail? Maybe we drop 25,000, maybe 50 to 100,000. Well, if you went to a business school to learn about somebody else's startup, what would you be doing? We'd probably be spending another 50 to 100,000. You'd be reading some case study. You'd be sitting in a room trying to argue with somebody else about what your interpretation of that case study is. And you might have some second or third hand view of what you think a startup or a company is all about. And that's bullshit. What you should be doing is trying and failing, either in your own startup or in a large company. Those are the places you're going to get the experiences to understand what it means and what it means to build a startup, what it means to build a company. And failing at your own startup is a better use of money and time than going to get some fucking MBA where someone tells you some case study about how you might be able to build a startup. You're writing some business plan that's full of lies and projections for 3 to 5 years of revenue, and you are over-engineering for an outcome that has a very low probability of reality. So don't read about somebody else's startup and pay them. Go get some money or save some money and build your own fucking startup and fail at it a couple times and you'll learn a few things. And that is not bad. And some of you might even be successful. So we call this making lots of little bets. And you, as founders and company builders, you make lots of little bets too. You make lots of little bets in product decisions, in design decisions, in marketing decisions. You don't wait and build this big-ass product and then ship it all at once. You want to build small kind of pieces to test your hypotheses about what customer psychology and customer behavior looks like, what features are needed, what product things are differentiated from other products in the market, what pricing strategies are going to generate the most revenue or the most amount of opportunity for me in the market. Well, we do that as VCs too. We make lots of little bets. In fact, for our fund, we start with several hundred companies, probably 200 to 300 companies, and we know that probably 3 or 4 out of 5 of those are going to fail. We expect failure rates as high as 60 to 80% in our portfolio. And even for the ones that survive and succeed, they might not have huge exits. They might only return 1 to 3x, maybe 3 to 5x in capital. But probably about a third of those companies will get to some level of progress with their product, with their customers, with revenue, with other investors. And maybe on a few of those, we'll put another check in. And maybe on the ones that get to Series A and B, we'll put another check in. Or maybe the ones that get profitable, if they still need capital, we'll put some more in. Probably, if we're lucky, 5 to 10% of our companies might have outsized outcomes 10 to 20x or better. Maybe another 10 to 30% might have small outcomes of 3 to 5x or better. Probably none of those are billion-dollar companies. Also a good thing, you do not need to have a billion-dollar company to be successful. You probably do not need a $100 million company to be successful. You need to be able to build a product, solve a customer need, make some money on that customer's need, and figure out how you can scale your business. And so when we think about how we build companies or how we invest in companies, we think in 3 stages: product, market, revenue. How do we test each of those hypotheses? And by the way, you might do the revenue hypothesis before the market, but for us as investors, we're looking for scale. And so what we want to see is that in the product validation stage, you probably are doing this on your own money or your own savings or a small amount of funding. And your job is to test for some level of functional use, some level of customer usage. Can you build a product that is functional, and does anybody use it? Hopefully not someone who is your mom. After you succeed in that hypothesis, which is not a given, now maybe you're trying to expand your market opportunity, start to test for revenue, and you might have different goals. You might be trying to generate revenue, you might be trying to grab customers, you might be trying to generate profitable revenue, but really you're trying to figure out, is this a large and scalable opportunity, and can I figure out potentially profitable channels of customer acquisition? Note that I am not now trying to build features as much as I am trying to grow customers and test for revenue. And then lastly, now I'm in the venture capital stage. I'm trying to build a very large company. And now I really am trying to get a lot of customers, get a lot of revenue, get a lot of profit, think about exits and opportunities so I can satisfy my investors. And now we're scaling up the organization. Now you might actually need to incur large costs. You might spend ahead of getting the revenue. Now you might go raise a large round of funding from very traditional Series A and B, or even larger VCs. That's how we think about it. Product, market, revenue. How do you scale? How do you get functional product, scale up the market profitably, ideally, and then how do you go for large revenue or large profitability opportunities? So I'm running a little bit over. I just want to talk about platforms and distribution. Again, the thing mentorship is very important, understanding distribution, all these different geographies they're going after, but I want to focus particularly on customer acquisition and platforms. So I think you probably know a lot of the companies on the left here. How many people recognize the icon on the far top right? Do you know what that is? Anyone want to yell it out? WeChat. What's so special about WeChat? It's everything. It's about 600 million users. It didn't exist 3 years ago. WhatsApp, also several hundred million users. Not several hundred million years. That's dinosaurs. So all these, the products on the right, very, very recent, but hundreds of millions and on their way to probably billions of users. What does this mean? This means that I can get distribution and customer acquisition on these platforms. Again, remember that I said a lot of these things we still don't understand very well. They are very new platforms. Even platforms like search, we don't really know that much. How many people think here that you understand paid search and organic search really well? Now, all of you should be fucking raising your hand. How many of you know how to do an email list really well? Yes, I've scared the piss out of you. None of you are raising your hand anymore. These things are critical, functional foundation blocks of your startup. How many people know how to program in a modern programming language? A lot more hands. How many people know how to do design and UX? You can build some HTML or some mock-ups. Okay, more hands. These are the critical functional skill sets. I want you to understand how to program, how to design, how to do marketing, online marketing. Last point. You can go global. You can go local. I don't really give a fuck. If you want to come to the Valley, that's great. If you want to stay where you are, that's great too. Probably, if you are in a developed market of 50 million people or more, you don't need to move. If you're in a developing market of 100 to 200 million people or more, you probably don't need to move. You can choose to move if you want. And by the way, there's interesting places to move to that are not called Silicon Valley, like Beijing and Bangalore and Sao Paulo, and actually even Jordan and Dubai. And those places are interesting because why? There are large aggregations of languages and speakers. In particular, I would present to you, there are 4 global languages: English, Mandarin, Spanish, and Arabic. Arabic and Spanish, probably 300 to 500 million speakers, growing population. Mandarin, over 1 billion, maybe flat population growth. And English, probably 1 billion first language speakers and 2 or 3 billion second language speakers, and it's growing. And I'm not trying to be a boorish American, but pretty much English will be the de facto standard language for the web very, very soon if it isn't already. But the other ones are interesting as well. So once you start to understand, like, what are the geographies? What is the web penetration? What is kind of the opportunities? Some of those, even though they might be smaller language aggregations, could be very interesting because there's less competition. Some of them could be very interesting because the number of users and number of smartphones are rising rapidly. And in those geographies also, payment distribution, logistics, understanding customer acquisition, these are all going to get better. So you think that everything is in English and you think that Silicon Valley is king of the hell. Kind of true right now, but more and more over the next 5 to 10 years, other geographies will also become important. The other 3 to 6 billion people that don't speak English will become very important. Their payments will get better. Their distribution logistics will get better. The opportunities for you to succeed in those platforms and languages will get better. So you don't need to come to Silicon Valley. If you want to, sure, come to Silicon Valley. But Silicon Valley is not a physical place. It is a thing in your mind, and it is a process for learning how to build startups, and it is becoming a global phenomenon. And I encourage you to become part of it. Thank you for your time.